Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the Naumann Foundation for Freedom's International Conference Restart 21. I'm Melinda Crane, and it is a great pleasure to accompany you as moderator. This is the second in a series of panels that are devoted, as you could see in the film that we just saw, to restarting discussion about pressing challenges that will shape our post-pandemic world, exploring, as we did in yesterday's launch discussion of the new digital world order, how liberal values can guide Europe in shaping solutions to those challenges that reinforce both freedom and fairness, trust and security, as well as competition and access. Our title today is United in Autonomy, Liberal Ideas to Increase Europe's Ability to Act. The term European strategic autonomy was formally inaugurated 5 years ago as part of the EU's global strategy. Now, it's notably higher on the political agenda due to the pandemic and intensifying geopolitical rivalry. That goes for the economic realm, of course, with concerns about the resilience of supply chains in sensitive and strategic industries, as well as for the area of defense and security. We're going to address the former, the economic realm, in our globalization panel on this Thursday. This evening, we want to focus on security. EU member states pay recognition, at least formally, to the goal of making Europe a security player capable of taking independent action in an increasingly turbulent world. Yet the concept of European strategic autonomy often seems to mean different things to different actors. Can we find common ground on the scope, prerequisites for, and limits to European strategic autonomy? That's the key question this evening, and we have an absolutely outstanding panel to address it. Before I introduce them, just a very quick word, dear ladies and gentlemen, on how you can participate in our discussion, because we're very eager to hear your questions and short comments. You can bring them in via the Q&A function on this live stream, and I will pass a selection of these on to our panelists a little bit later on. And we also invite you to participate in short audience polls. And I'd like to conduct a poll right now to get us started. Our poll question is Europe currently able to act autonomously in the security and defense realm? And our solutions, our answers to that are quite simple, either yes or no. Is Europe able to act autonomously in the security and defense realm? Please vote now, and then we'll go back and take a look at the results in just a moment after I introduce our panel. And now it is my great pleasure to greet Professor Sven Biskup. He is Director of Europe in the World program at the Brussels-based Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations. He teaches European foreign and defense policy at Ghent University, is an honorary fellow of the European Security and Defense College, and senior research fellow at the People's University of China in Beijing. Professor Biskup, great that you can join us for this discussion. Welcome. And I'm very pleased to welcome Julia Friedlander. She is C. Boyden Gray Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Global Business and Economics Program at the Atlantic Council. She has worked on transatlantic security and European issues, both at the U.S. National Security Council and at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. And she joins us from Washington. Julia, great to have you with us. And it's a pleasure to welcome Michael Link. He's a member of the German Bundestag for the Free Democrats, and he serves as a member of the Bundestag Committee on European Union Affairs and as chair of the Subcommittee on European Union Issues. He's a former Minister of State in the German Foreign Office, and he also held the position of Federal Commissioner for Franco-German Cooperation. Wonderful that you are with us this evening, Michael Link. And finally, I am very pleased to welcome, I seem to have lost my card for our fourth speaker. And so I'm going to forget your forename. I'm very sorry. He is Mr. Al-Halabi. He joins us from Istanbul, where he works for the Commodities Intelligence Tracing Organization or Information Organization, and he will remind us in just a moment of his first name. Great to have you with us as well.
Bashar.
Thank you, Bashar. So great that you can join us to give us that viewpoint from the Middle East. And now it is a pleasure to take a look at our poll results. And let me just see what you've told us about whether you think that Europe can act autonomously. And I must say, 60% of those who responded to our poll say no. Europe cannot, at the moment, act autonomously in the security and defense realm. Just 20% of our respondents say yes, and another 20% say partly. So let us now unpack that result with our panelists. And dear panel, give us, if you would, your take on that response, as well as an answer to whether you think that you see a need for greater European sovereignty and independence on security. And if so, where, in what particular regions or issue areas would you say it's absolutely crucial to see an expansion of European strategic autonomy? And I'll begin, if I may, with Professor Biskup.
Thank you. Well, for me, it is obvious that we need to have more power to take care of our own security. The reason is simple. Almost 10 years ago now, President Barack Obama announced the so-called pivot to Asia, which means in very simple terms that for the first time since the Second World War, the priority theater for American strategy is no longer Europe, it's Asia. And that has remained the structural trend in American grand strategy ever since. And the implication, I think, is very obvious. It means that in a very hypothetical scenario of a crisis in Europe and in Asia at the same time, the Americans would likely prioritize Asia. In other words, American reinforcements will come, but they may come later and in smaller numbers than we have hitherto planned for. So Europeans have to beef up their own defense capabilities, because when you organize it in NATO, in the EU, it doesn't matter, but the first line of deterrence and defense in Europe will have to be European. And you may be transatlanticist for all that you want, but the Americans have a vote in it. And the Americans have voted Asia first. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I'll move straight on to Julia Friedlander to get your take on the same question and the take, of course, from your side of the Atlantic.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me today on this panel. You know, I think there's a very it's sort of a conflicting ethos in Washington about surrounding European strategic autonomy. The side that says, you know, Europe is no longer the problem. We've moved well beyond a Cold War scenario where they've become equal or co-equal or close to equal partners in many ways on the global stage, and therefore we rely on them to bear their share of the burden, but also we'll recognize that they have certain capabilities in the European neighborhood that the United States, quite frankly, doesn't have. You know, in the Mediterranean, in certain parts of Africa, and in certain parts of the Middle East, where you know, the U.S. footprint comes with American consequences, as we've seen over the past 15 years. So, you know, there's a bit of an indecision here. Would we like to see Europeans be able to move autonomously and therefore not follow an American lead? And that's, I think, the great unanswered question. What happens when we actually allow the Europeans to say, actually, our priority is here and we're not going to follow you, America, but we are going to say, this isn't a European priority and this is where we're focusing on before we join you at another NATO mission in Afghanistan, for example. So I think that is sort of the inner debate in Washington. My personal opinion is that is when we're responding to the poll, perhaps, is that I'm an optimist, and I think that, you know, speaking with European counterparts, I think sometimes Americans don't understand the very rapid progression of European integration over the past 20 years. That the Lisbon Treaty was not very long ago. That we actually are on a quick trajectory towards greater European capabilities. We just can't. We sort of think that it's been there forever. Just that it actually hasn't. And so in some areas with specific EU missions, I would say the EU is actually quite capable and quite capable of demonstrating that they can do limited missions without direct US support. So I'm a cautious optimist.
Let me get another view from beyond Europe before I come to a politician who, in fact, can help shape European strategic autonomy. And so, Basha al-Halabi, as I mentioned, you are based in the Middle East, and your company, Clipper, assesses commodity flows in the Middle East, which are clearly very directly affected by major security and strategic issues there. Now, we just heard, Julia Friedlander reminded us, the Middle East is often seen as Europe's neighbor, and geographically, of course, it is so. And European interests are very directly touched by events there, as we could see during the 2015 refugee crises, amongst other developments. And yet, there's a perception that Europe is perhaps less engaged in the Middle East than it has been in the past. What's your take on that? What do people in your area, both regionally but also in the area in which you work, say about Europe and its engagement now with the Middle East?
Thank you. Well, personally, I don't think Europe is less engaged in the Middle East. However, Europe's engagement in the Middle East has changed over the years and over the decades. And this last decade, which basically I'm referring to the period between 2010 and 2020, has posed a major crisis and challenge for Europe and its security. Because going back to the question and the poll that was posed on the viewers in general, Europe does not seem to handle well the hard power competition when it comes to neighbors. However, it definitely has enough leverage sometimes or assets in order to engage on a soft power basis. And this is why the past 10 years, if we want to look from a macro perspective and observe Europe's track record, we can say that the blunders were more than actually the successes. We can look at Libya, we can look at Syria, we can look even at Egypt in regards to the human rights record over there and everything else. In addition to Europe's main allies in the region right now and trade partners that are the Gulf, that is basically the Gulf GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and Israel. So this past decade has posed a lot of problems. However, the changes that the region is undergoing at the moment, first of all, offers Europe an opportunity to exercise more and more its soft power capabilities with less conflict happening at the moment, or at least a pause is taking place in the region with a reconfiguration of the security architecture. In addition to the fact that the American retrenchment in the region, which has been a staple policy since the Obama administration days, which a fellow panelist just mentioned, due to its decision to pivot to Asia, also offers Europe an opportunity as well in order to safeguard its security, in addition to play a more proactive role instead of a reactive role in this region.
Thank you very much. And I want to come back to the soft power issue a little bit later on. But let me go now to Michael Link for your take both on the audience poll and where you see a need for greater European strategic autonomy. I believe you're on mute.
So I thought it was coming automatically.
There you go.
Sorry, I'm sitting here in Strasbourg and it's a little bit improvised. No, First of all, Melinda, thank you very much for letting me speak after our friends from with the Middle East perspective, because this very, very clearly shows us that EU is too much inward looking. We are too busy with our own things, and we completely underestimate our potential weight and role, which we could play in other areas of the world. Therefore, indeed, yes, we need greater EU capability to get our act together. Whether we need more autonomy, that is maybe a little bit a different question, because in the German language, autonomy, of course, the immediate next question is autonomy from whom? Is it a step away from NATO? Is it a step away from the US? Well, certainly not. Being a free Democrat, of course, I insist very much, and my party insisted very much, that we need a cooperation with the United States, which is as close as possible. We believe in this Western alliance, we believe in NATO, but also we believe that a stronger EU, let's call it also a European pillar in NATO, would be helpful. And let's be frank, because I think our viewers want some frank issues. Without the presidency of Donald Trump, probably we would not have this discussion on European autonomy, because President Trump's presidency was a wake-up call for many in Europe that our closest ally suddenly is not reliable anymore, or even tries to actively undermine the unity of the European Union. It was a shock, a real shock for many in the EU, that out of the White House we did get hits at European unity when he actively supported Brexit and other things. So that was the total opposite of what we expect from an ally. And therefore, of course, these calls for European autonomy to develop, but let's not go in this false track. What I like more is the notion, what we also as liberals prefer to call it, we speak more about a sort of a strategic sovereignty of Europe. Europe needs to grow up in terms of capabilities and develop some sovereign capacities, not independent of the US, but partnership in leadership, leadership in partnership, and therefore not autonomous from the US, but in joint partnership to develop instruments above the current nation state level. And that is why I introduced the word sovereignty, where we can pool our sovereignty in terms of foreign and defense policy. I think that is the way forward, but not coupling off from NATO.
May I just ask you, because much of the concern about decoupling from NATO as possibly being the implication of European strategic autonomy, much of that concern arose in regard to France and to whether France and Germany are truly aligned, or whether perhaps when the French talk about European strategic autonomy, what they really mean is essentially a second pillar apart from NATO. How closely aligned would you say that Germany and France are now on the concept of European strategic autonomy and how it relates to NATO?
I think we have a huge opportunity with the current French president, Macron, because unlike a lot of his rivals to the right and to the left, Le Pen on the right, of course, certainly, but also others on the left, or even some take some very conservative Republican leaders who share a very old style goalist approach to sovereignty, they will certainly not go and be as ready to cooperate in NATO as Macron is. I was very sad to see this public dispute between Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, well, our US friends know her better as AKK, and the President Macron, when they openly disputed about these things. I think there is a lot of misunderstandings. I have been in close contact very often with our French colleagues and friends, especially from the president's party and from the centrist parties, and they don't want something which is decoupled from NATO, but they rightly insist that Germany also is ready to assume more responsibility in creating military capacities, military capabilities, and of course also military missions, what we Europeans can run if necessary alone, but running it alone and developing new capabilities should never be seen as deciding on our own without consulting with our closest ally in NATO. And therefore, all these capabilities, they need, and there we need to be careful, they need to be developed in a way that we don't double structures with NATO structures.
Thank you very much, and we'll come back in a little while to the topic about what more Germany can and is willing to do, also in view of the upcoming election here in Germany. But first, let me go to Professor Biskup and ask you, if we look back to the time when the concept of European strategic autonomy was introduced, as I said, in the European global strategy, in the EU global strategy, it did in fact spur some alarm, not only in the US, but also in Eastern Europe, amongst members who did worry that perhaps this was an attempt to decouple Europe from NATO. Would you say that that concern has now been dispelled also amongst Eastern European countries?
Well, let me be very professorial for a moment and first correct Mr. Link. Because it is not true that strategic autonomy was a response to Donald Trump. As you said, it was presented in the global strategy. The global strategy was ready in June 2016, when all of us were very confident that Hillary Clinton would win the elections, and Donald Trump won them the elections in November. So strategic autonomy was not a response to Trump, which means obviously we should not abandon it because Trump is gone. Strategic autonomy was a clear response to the refocusing of American grand strategy. And it is logical that the Americans do not look entirely the same at the world as we do, and our interests do not entirely overlap. And to be honest, I mean, I find it almost adorable how many convinced transatlanticists continue to profess their love for the Atlantic Alliance, but always forget that the Americans have a vote in that, right? And the Americans, as I said, already have voted. For them, Europe is now a secondary theater. We are less allies to be protected as allies to be gotten on their side in their rivalry with China. And we have all interest, I think, therefore, to pursue our autonomy and our priorities in diplomacy, in economic policy, where I think nobody questions this, and also in security and defense. And the whole debate about duplication with NATO, frankly, is a false debate. I always explain it this way, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, we now have 3 separate armies, of course. Let's say that tomorrow our 3 countries decide to close down our national armies and create one Benelux army. Would that be a problem for NATO? Well, obviously not. It would actually make NATO's life simpler because instead of with 3 defense ministers, they have only to deal with one Benelux defense minister. So if now tomorrow 27 EU member states would say, well, we pool our defense assets together, why would that in any way be a detriment to NATO? Instead, we would have more capabilities. So we would automatically contribute more to NATO, but we would also create the capacity to act on our own when necessary. Not for the fun of it, but when necessary, because when the next crisis in North Africa happens that calls for intervention, it is very likely that the United States will say, well, this is your problem, you deal with it. And they will be right to say that. So I think, let's be very realistic and pragmatic about this and just accept the facts. Thanks.
Michael Link, do you want to respond to that? I think we can probably all agree that the concept got a jump start, let's say, through the Donald Trump presidency. But perhaps you want to respond to some of the other points that were just made as well.
Well, I mean, here I think we have some disagreement, but I think that is totally normal in this area, where we indeed, as Free Democrats, we see the danger of duplication. And if you speak with practitioners, both from NATO and EU, we see I see no use in duplicating command structures. That is something what we would criticize. I see no advantage in duplicating command structures, and the practitioners, both from NATO and EU, of course, also can identify these. So I think we should not shy away from also clearly saying that here we have a different view. Yes, indeed, we are staunch transatlanticists because we think we should not risk an existing alliance, but we should instead increase European sovereignty. Indeed, that is why we Free Democrats prefer to speak of sovereignty, not of autonomy. because here we are, that expresses much better what we see as important. And Europe, the European Union, sorry, needs clearly more sovereignty in foreign and security policy. I think there, again, we agree with Professor Biskup, because it is totally unconceivable, totally strange, and that we in the 21st century still don't have a foreign minister for the European Union. It is still totally crazy that, of course, we have these different military structures in EU member states. And therefore, we want a lot more of putting together military capabilities, both on the horizontal and vertical level between EU member states. There, I totally share your view. And especially, of course, I think Germans and French need to be ready for change. French need to be ready to, let's say, yes, give the EU a real role in foreign and security policy. And the Germans have to be ready to give also a modernized view on military missions, which cannot be exclusively, of course, purely German military missions. We need to have a decision-making on the EU level that requires also constitutional debate in Germany, because, as you know, we are very sensible when it comes to investing in our military missions, or decide if we really want this EU capacity, then both of us, French and Germans, need to overcome some national traditions in order to gain European capability to act.
Julia Friedlander, if I can just bring you in here. Professor Biskup talked about the age-old burden-sharing discussion within NATO. And clearly, Joe Biden may now be in the White House, but that doesn't mean that this discussion is going away. The pressure is still there. The 2% goal still is not being met by a number of European countries, amongst them the one where I'm sitting right now, Germany. When you look at this discussion about European strategic autonomy, do you ever find yourself asking how seriously we can take it, given the fact that countries like Germany, Europe's biggest economy, are still not meeting that 2% goal?
Yeah, quite frankly, I do. I think first the putting the 2% number on it, of course, it was it seemed like a very bright idea at the time in Wales, but the way it was used and then weaponized under the Trump administration as a point of leverage that brought in other elements of burden sharing, so to speak, such as trade, right? As of course gave it a false moniker. I think if you listen to Secretary Gates, for example, at the end of the Obama administration, his language was extremely hard and harsh about European contributions, not to NATO, is that they had to pay into some sort of pot to sort of show the Americans that they're grateful, but for their own in their own strategic interest. And I have had many quite frank conversations with European counterparts to say, what would happen if we actually went to war right now, right? How would that actually land, right? And quite frankly, it remains quite worrying again, I'm actually an economist, and so I look at this a lot from a slightly different perspective, but it does remain worrying, and I can tell you that those conversations are ongoing now, but they will not be used as points of leverage or in threatening terms anymore, which comes as a bit of a blessing and a curse. I think that Nalink is nodding, because I actually recall a conversation I had with him in the White House a few years ago about this, that pressure works, right? And that was ultimately, I think, the false lesson that the Trump administration, and perhaps even those who criticized the Trump administration, learned, was that you have to hold feet to the fire before you have a lasting conversation about this. So, just a short answer to answer your question. I think you have to put the cart before the horse in many ways, and so developing a concept of what it means for European military capabilities to be deployed independent of the United States has to be a precursor to being able to convince governments to pay up to fulfill them. And that, I think, is a lot of the my estimation of what needs to happen in Germany.
I want to get our other panelists' take on that as well, but let me first go to Bashar al-Halabi to ask you about the perception in the Middle East in regard to the links between the US and Europe, because essentially the whole debate about burden sharing in NATO is a debate about whether Europe too long has been riding on American coattails, as we would say, rather than taking up its responsibility. And that is an argument that is sometimes made also in regard to Europe's lack of engagement in the Middle East, that it has simply sort of hidden behind the US or let the US do the hard work. But as you mentioned, the US is looking to get out of the Middle East, to take its troops out of the Middle East and to wind down its own involvement there. So from your perspective in the Middle East, what would you want to see Europe do that it's not currently doing? Where would you say there are missed opportunities for European engagement in a realistic sense? Because clearly Europe is not about to send tens of thousands of troops into hotspots in the Middle East. But what realistically would you like to see Europe do more than it's doing now?
Well, to start with, I think it was President Barack Obama's exit interview with The Atlantic, the Obama Doctrine that was written at a later stage when he openly described certain allies in the Middle East, US allies in the Middle East, as free riders. So like certain medium powers, let's call them that, in the region, kind of faced the same fate and the same concerns and worries as the Europeans are facing. However, the infrastructure is not present in the region. Even the GCC, excuse me, we saw it kind of or teeter over the past 4 years, or since 2017, before its member states reconciled or are in the process of reconciliation. So this concern is definitely also a concern that the Middle East reflects and mirrors, similar to that of the Europeans. However, the powers in the region, when they look at how events are unfolding between the United States and the European Union, of course, this kind of pushes them to do two things. First of all, we are seeing certain countries in the region assuming or wanting to assume larger share of responsibility or even of power in terms of security and military architecture. And this is something that is backfiring and has backfired in Libya and in elsewhere, in Yemen or other places. And also Gulf mainly countries and other MENA countries hope to build a better strategic and stronger cooperation with European countries in order to fill this void that might be left in the region following the US retrenchment, while also taking into consideration that there are certain powers, regional powers like Iran and Turkey that continue to grow their influence and continue to expand and continue to cause threats in general, whether security threats or otherwise, to the countries in the region and this is posing a major crisis and as a result of entrenched fault lines at the moment, which needs to be tackled. And this is where Europe can actually play a role at the moment also, given things started to cool down in the region due to a new administration in the US and due to a shifting or reorientation of policies for the moment after the pandemic and a low or a blow that was dealt to the oil market. Europe can step in at the moment and try to mend ties and build on the track two, let's say, dialogues that are happening between regional rivalries in order to ensure stability and to stabilize also the region, which will definitely affect Europe positively in the medium to long term.
Let's stay with that topic for a moment, and a quick follow-up question to you, first of all, Bashar al-Halabi, before we go to the other panelists. Arguably, you might say that one of the greatest European successes in terms of at least responsibility, if not autonomy, was the work that was done to get the Iran agreement, the JCPOA. And after the Trump administration pulled out of that agreement, there were attempts made by Europe independently from the US, of course, to attempt to keep the agreement afloat, as it were, by creating new payment systems. Utterly failed. So when you look at European strategic autonomy, even in this area where it was about diplomatic initiatives, do you really see much to be confident about going forward?
Well, there might be something to be confident about if this, European diplomacy in general is also accompanied by building European powers in general, whether it's military or security, and also economically as well, where it can build actually more and more leverage over countries in the region in order to engage and in order to be able to influence outcomes. But when Europe tried to simply devise a new payment system with Iran in order to continue probably the investments that were brought up or agreed upon during the JCPOA, while American sanctions were hanging above everyone's heads, it was impossible for this to happen. So for Europe to be able to become an actor and to be able to shape outcomes in the region, it doesn't have to solely deploy its diplomatic efforts in the region, but it also has to have a different, a more probably assertive approach, and also a more rewarding approach where it can work with its allies in order to ensure certain achievements are reached, while also trying to work on its ability right now, for example, to bring or at least to carry on with the negotiations and the talks that are happening between regional rivalries or regional rivals, where Europe stands kind of in the middle between them. And I'm referring to basically, for example, Iran and Saudi Arabia, or let's say Turkey and Saudi Arabia, in order to play a better role in ensuring that this tension does not escalate again, and flare-ups cause any kind of insecurity for Europe in general, as we've seen over the past decade.
Mm-hmm. Who would like to give me their take on what we've just heard there? Michael Link, you're sort of, nodding and shaking your head at the same time.
Well, nodding, of course, when it comes to whether I'm ready to answer on this, but nodding, shaking the head when it comes to yes, the concrete question of projecting EU diplomacy in that region. Let me give you one example. That is, today we have the Libya conference, or tomorrow we will have the next Libya conference on Libya. Very important that EU really gets their act together, because in the last year and after the first Libya conference, we saw Italy and France very, very much on different sides. We saw it on very different sides when it came to the assessment of the actors in Libya. We saw Germany somewhere in the middle, but we saw really no clear line of the EU in that important, super important conflict. And it goes way beyond Libya. We all agree, of course, that the whole migration, the whole refugee issue, of course, the refugee issue of refugees is closely linked to Libya. So if we don't get our act as EU together, if we don't have the courage to really formulate our foreign policy by qualified majority voting, if we continue the way that all members of the EU, especially those in the Security Council, do their own job and their own thing, we will never get to a strong European voice there. And that is certainly not the way to go forward. That is why we think we need, I repeat, indeed, even sovereignty in foreign policy decision making. Otherwise, it will certainly not be up to the expectations. Look how Europe has been, not only in the Middle East, but also in the Middle East, has been divided also over Turkey lately. You saw French reactions on Turkey, you saw Italian reactions much more softer. Italy and French clashing openly, not only over Libya, but also over how to approach the Turkish issues. So this is certainly not the way to go. And there we have so much homework to do as Europeans. If we want a strong EU, then we need to have the courage also to go a step further in integration into a federal state, which implies also this decision-making on the foreign policy and defense level jointly.
Professor Biskup, a crucial reminder there, of course, that foreign and security policy are inextricably interlinked, and that if Europe can't get together on the one, it's not going to be very successful in a common approach to the other.
That is true, but it's also often abused as an excuse. You have a lot of people say, oh, there's no point in trying to integrate the military until we have a foreign policy that's integrated, and result is nothing happens because everybody is waiting for everybody else. So I would rather pursue all of that at the same time. I mean, I am a very classic Belgian Euro federalist, so I totally agree that the ideal end state is a federal Europe with, voting by majority on foreign policy as on defense policy. But then you have to be honest, if you go for a federal Europe, that means strategic autonomy. And honestly, I don't think we should get into a semantics debate about is it sovereignty or is it autonomy? It's precisely the same thing. You need to be able to do two things. You need to be able to take your own decisions, meaning that nobody is taking your decisions for you. That is classic sovereignty. And you need the capacity to act upon those decisions. You need to be able to implement them. That is strategic autonomy. Sovereignty without capacity to act is nice. I mean, my own country, Belgium, are we fully sovereign? Yes. Are we sovereign in the military sphere? Yes. We can in all sovereignty decide not to do something. Can we decide to do something as Belgium? No. We cannot act militarily without support from other European states and the United States. So it's by pooling our efforts, precisely by creating a federal Europe, that we regain the sovereignty and the strategic autonomy, which often at the national level we have already lost. And I was glad to hear Mr. Link say that, and I there agree, the key is in France and Germany. They have the scale to kickstart this. I always say that if one is serious about European foreign policy, then the first step would be close down the Auswärtiges Amt, close down the Quai d'Orsay and merge them. And there we have a start. And I'm sure if you could do that, then the Benelux would join. But as long as we have 27 foreign policies and an EU foreign policy somewhat on the side of that, yeah, then indeed it will be touch and go. I think the GCPOA, its creation was a success, and Libya is indeed a failure. We intervened militarily with the Americans, and then all of us, including the Americans, dropped the ball, and now we lost Libya, so to say. Thanks.
Let me ask Julia Friedlander, if I may, to again give us that look from your side of the Atlantic, also in regard to the endeavor to transfer sovereignty in Europe into any form of supranational body when it comes to common foreign and defense policy. Because frankly, if we look at the pandemic and how it has played out in Europe, what we've seen is a reminder of how cumbersome EU bureaucracy and decision-making can be. So how does that play out for you when you do look at the discussion about CSP, common security and defense policy, PESCO, and so on? How optimistic would you be that these can really be instruments that can be fit for purpose?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there are definitely several camps in there in Washington, and I think, again, going back to what I said earlier, some would like to see CSP not be successful because ultimately we would like to remain, we'd like to remain the white elephant in the room at NATO and think that that is the most efficient way to make decisions. There are those who would say, this is great. It's long time coming. We should throw all of our weight behind it because ultimately this is what makes Europe a stronger actor. I think that there's certainly a lot to be, I don't think that we are and sort of blind to the divisions in Europe at all. In fact, it's sort of sometimes used to our advantage to be able to find those like-minded partners who think more like us and try to elevate them either at NATO or in Europe, and try to pump those guys up and say, well, here are the talking points that we'd like you to use, right? And I think that there's hesitancy about EU decision-making processes because, quite frankly, we're not in that room. And so we have to find our proxies to be able to represent an American position. Look, what I would also say, however, in the sort of maybe moving a little bit away from CSDP and back to sort of my hat as an economist, looking at the links between national security and economic policy, right, is that Europe has massive ability to act using current mechanisms that are allowed for on the Brussels level that do not require qualified majority voting, which are just as effective as military capabilities. And of course, I'm thinking about China here and economic and trade challenges posed by Beijing. And so, if we look at the tools that Brussels does possess already, and then the light year advancement, quite frankly, that they have achieved over the past couple of years, whether it's in export controls or screening incoming investments or use of trade and tariff remedies, or competition policy, where, quite frankly, the EU is light years ahead of the United States. We're first trying to pass a bill through Congress this week to try to address that issue. That has to be incorporated into how we view, how we assess European capabilities to act as well. Because as we are learning more and more, military capabilities are one thing, economic ones are just as important, and the role that they play are potentially just as important as, quite frankly, as military readiness.
Let me ask you to just apply that, if you would, to the Middle East, because we just heard Bashar saying to us that, in his opinion, there is a great deal more that Europe could do. So what capabilities would be needed for Europe to play that role? Is it a question of political will, or is it a question of other economic and hard military capabilities in regard to the Middle East?
I think it's a question of both, but also understanding how those, exactly coming to a common understanding about how those tools can be used in a national security context. And that, I think we're sort of circling around like a hawk, looking at how to deal with the China problem, as I just mentioned. But if we think about areas of where we would like to stabilize areas of the Middle East, either through sanctions or through investment policies or whatnot, again, I think that those might be just as applicable as looking at where boots can go on the ground in the region.
Thank you very much. And I want to come to issues related to China and to multilateral partnerships in general in just a moment. But let me first stay with one point that has also been critical in regard to the links between European strategic autonomy and NATO. Professor Biskup, some key NATO member countries, of course, are not in the EU. And therefore, one crucial question here is if Europe is serious about strategic autonomy, whether there are workable solutions for crisis management and long-term planning that, for example, involve key actors like the UK or Norway.
Yeah, I mean, the political expression of Europe is, of course, the European Union, right? I mean, if we have one chance as Europeans to have global impact and to maintain ourselves vis-a-vis continent-sized great powers like China, Russia, and US, it is by acting together through the Union. There is no other alternative. So we must use that. That said, obviously, if of necessity we need to act in our own neighborhood among Europeans only, it seems logical to me that every time we try to involve the non-EU NATO allies, the non-EU European NATO allies, so specifically the UK and Norway, if they are interested also in capability development mechanisms, etc., it would be technically very feasible to associate themselves with that. So there is not the real problem, I think. I mean, of course, it would be neat and easier if all EU members would be NATO members. It would, in a way, be more logical. The biggest problem is actually still Cyprus, which is the only EU member state that does not have any official status in NATO. It's neither a member nor a partner. All the others are. And that constantly acts as a blockage. But so the problems are political. It is that, on the one hand, Europeans always claim that they want autonomy, but not too much autonomy, not so much autonomy that the Americans will not come and save us when we're in trouble. And so we don't really know what we want. And on the other hand, the Americans don't know what to want, because they always exhort us to do more, but not too much more, not so much more that they would lose control. And with both sides being ambiguous about this now for almost 30 years, we are stuck in the eternal EU-NATO beauty contest. I mean, I've personally been writing about it since I was a student, since 1998. And sometimes I find that something that I've written back in 1998, if you change the date, could have been written yesterday, because the debate on EU-NATO relations hasn't moved at all.
Let me ask Michael Link or what he thinks that German voters want, because I think very often there's a pretty wide discrepancy between what the German political elite thinks is necessary and what German citizens are prepared to do. And we've seen some of this seeping into the discussion in regard to the upcoming federal parliamentary elections. And it divides even German political parties, like the Greens, with the Greens party chairman saying that he could imagine delivery of defensive weapons to Ukraine, and immediately getting lots of pushback from within his own party. So where do you see this debate on strategic autonomy going here within Europe's biggest economy and largest EU member state?
Well, again, I think that the presidency of Donald Trump created a lot of readiness for many more Germans than before. That the EU really needs to develop capacities and capabilities to, if need be, go it alone. But again, I would not call that autonomy. I would rather call that a sovereignty to act. And the German voters, for them, they don't care so much indeed about the semantic differences. That is more for the politicians indeed and for the specialists. But for the German voters, that was a wake-up call to see Brexit on the one side, which was certainly for us a very, very negative point. Then another wake-up call was, of course, the whole situation in the refugee crisis, and then of course the Trump presidency, and now lately also the challenges we see from China, increasingly from Russia, but especially for many normal German voters who never care about foreign policy in their normal daily lives. The impact of Chinese presence when they buy strategic businesses and enterprises in Germany, or when they try to buy the parts of the Hamburg harbor. So people get sensible for this, and therefore there is a general readiness, really, to understand and to invest more in security. People feel that maybe there are outside powers which do not really want our best, and so I think it's really worth investing in that in the electoral campaign. We will do that very clearly. We are advocating the 2% goal, but we go further. We say we are advocating a 3% goal. For investment in security, meaning defense, development, and foreign policy, because we should see all three of these aspects together: development, foreign policy, and diplomacy. That goes hand in glove. And when the Green Party chairman or one of them is going to travel to Ukraine, and suddenly meets a reality, then of course it's welcome that he goes there. But maybe the Greens, and we will certainly make that an issue in the elections, the Greens are somehow ambiguous about all this. On the one side, they say they share Western values, but whenever it comes to military missions, they very often shy away. lately the Mali mission, an EU mission, by the way, the EU training mission in Mali, Greens abstained. They did not vote in favor. We are clearly in favor, also being an opposition party, because we think this is a very important thing. And the Greens also are very critical to the new fighter plane we try to develop together with France and Spain, the FCAS, the Future Combat Air System. So this is something which we really need to address in these ambiguities and double standards, and therefore we take a very clear position from our side behind increased EU capacities and behind NATO.
Let us, in fact, take a closer look now at that wider geopolitical picture that you mentioned, including the increasing the power of China, but also Russia's role in the world. And I'd like to do that by asking another audience poll, first of all, that looks at a very key liberal value, which is multilateralism, and asks which partnerships our audience thinks are most important for Europe's security in the future, given the geopolitical tensions on the horizon. So you have a multiple choice here, dear ladies and gentlemen. Once again, you can choose between different options, and they include the United States, Indo-Pacific, Middle East and North Africa, Eastern neighborhood. So please vote now, and we will then get a take from our panel on how they see it. And I'm just going to give that poll a moment to play out. Okay, I'm told that we're going to need another moment to get the results on that. So let me perhaps go to Julia Friedlander while we are waiting for that result. A key focus of President Biden's recent trip to Europe was to bring the Europeans on board, of course, when it comes to strategic rivalry with China. Many European member states, however, are concerned about a new Cold War with China. How do you see it? Can and should European strategic autonomy include a middle path for Europe when it comes to tensions with China?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think what I think that, what I think we have achieved over the past 4 years, and again, I say this sometimes with a chuckle, that, the beginning of the, in early 2017, a very prominent European think tanker visited us and said, well, what do you think the big issue on the transatlantic plate is going to be? Expecting us to say Russia. And we said China when we were met with skepticism. I don't think that anyone in any forum would approach that with any such skepticism now, right? We've established and moved the common assessment of China's behavior along light years again. And I think that we may not share the same rhetoric that we use when we approach things. We don't necessarily share the same capabilities. We do share the same assessment to the risks, being the military, economic, or counterintelligence, with many of our European partners. Now, well, I think that the United States may risk losing very eager partners for cooperation through the kind of rhetoric that they use, portraying a great battle between systems. When you can actually break things down into their component parts, and try to acknowledge that we will remain close trading and investment partners with China. We always talk about the European exposure. There is great United States exposure. It looks a little bit different, right? And so I think that this concept of signing on to a geostrategic competition is met with perhaps legitimate skepticism in Europe. And we have to find a way to craft those challenges and how we deal with them, commensurate not to our perceptions of what the Cold War might look like, or what the fight against terrorism might have looked like when we portray this sort of good and evil dichotomy.
And I do now have the result on that poll, and far and away the majority of those who responded said the United States is the most important partner for Europe on an ongoing basis. That was 89%. 33% said Indo-Pacific, 33% said Eastern Neighborhood, just 28% said Middle East and North Africa. Basha al-Halabi, who for you would be the key partners in the Middle East if, in fact, Europe were to say we need to make a stronger effort here to be proactive on foreign and security collaboration with Middle Eastern partners? Who would it be?
I think this goes back to the question Professor Sven posed, which is, what does Europe really want? I think Europe needs to figure out exactly what its strategic outlook is going to be like for the next 10, 20, and 50 years. Are they really willing to buy into the American rhetoric about the great power competition and, I don't know, hold hands and try to help or try to play a certain role in pushing back against Russian interference and the Chinese expansionism around the world? Or are they going to carve out their own path and pursue their own interests, which can actually put them in between the United States from one side and Russia and China from the other? So that depends. But however, in terms of Europe's national security in general, there are certain conventional powers in the region that have traditionally been allies of the EU in general, and that can continue to be allies with the EU. And I'm mostly referring to Egypt, for example. I'm referring to also the Gulf countries, which have worked over the past years to enhance and develop their relations with the Europeans in general. However, I know that Turkey poses a major dilemma for the EU at the moment, especially with Turkey wanting also to carve out actually its own path in the region, its own policies, which at times are at loggerheads or that are putting Turkey and other European and NATO allies at loggerheads. So this is a dilemma. However, Turkey continues to be, or can continue to be, a partner for the EU in terms of its pushback against Russian interference, and probably as a security ally in terms of trying to also cooperate with other European powers or with the EU in general in order to stabilize or firefight the fires in the region. But back to the main question, the Europeans, again, need to figure out what they want, because I'm going to just throw in Lebanon as an example at the moment. The country is literally collapsing. And so far, no one, I know that Lebanon does not have a strategic interest or poses a strategic interest to Europe. However, it can pose a threat to Europe because Lebanon harbors 1.5 million refugees between Syrian and Palestinian. And there probably might be, if the country collapses, there might be, I don't know, thousands or hundreds of thousands of Lebanese refugees. And I really hope that's not the case. But so far, aside from France, who historically has ties with Lebanon, no one has really, at least no one inside the EU, has really actively or proactively sought to figure out a certain solution or try to figure out a certain conflict resolution or crisis management for what Lebanon is passing through at the moment. So it goes back to exactly what the Europeans want, but I think the traditional allies of Europe in the region are there. They need to be pressed in order to maybe slowly toe the line with the European values and principles, because it will always be, because the situation right now will always pose a conflict and a dilemma for the Europeans. And for example, Egypt actually is a case in point, because from one side, I know we all know that Egypt can deliver, but from the other, we know that Egypt definitely does not represent European values or what the EU stands for in general.
Thank you very much. And let me go to Professor Biskup for a comment on a couple of different points, if you would, please. And I do have one eye on the time and another one on the audience questions that are coming in. So if you can, maybe just sort of hit the headlines on these. But first of all, the Middle East. As we saw in our poll result, that was the region that had the lowest share of people saying they are an important partner for us. Is that reflecting in part resignation about what's even possible there? If we look at Turkey, for example, a NATO ally, yet buying weapons systems for Russia. Bashar al-Halabi just talked about pushback against Russia, but of course we've also seen some playing off of Russia vis-a-vis the EU from Turkey. And on the other hand, these very transactional refugee agreements with Turkey that are clearly also always a Damocles sword over the EU's head once things get difficult. So relations with Turkey, relations with the Middle East, and then briefly, if you would, the Asian issue. We have an audience question here saying, even though the US is increasingly interested in Asia, does that really mean that its interest and engagement with Europe is declining? The questioner is skeptical about that.
All right, thank you. Well, I think the reticence to see the Middle East as a partner has to do with the gap between our rhetoric as EU and our practice. I think we often still somehow give the message that the point of our foreign policy is to democratize the world and to promote human rights. But the reality is we have no leverage, little or no leverage to do that. We cannot force countries to change from the inside. But we can try and influence their foreign policies, but it's very difficult to influence their domestic policies. And I think there we ought to be more honest with ourselves and say, what can we achieve in the Middle East? Not necessarily states that fully adopt our model, but rather states that are sufficiently effective, they provide their citizens with the public goods that they need, and states that are just sufficiently inclusive to enjoy the support of the majority of the local public opinion, so that the security and armed forces of those states would fight for those states if they are threatened. That's much more modest than saying, we're going to bring EU-style democracy to the Middle East. And I think if we're more honest about that, we could come to a more pragmatic relationship with those countries. Now, very quickly on Asia, I think indeed Europe has absolutely no interest in some sort of new Cold War or a new bipolarity. We and the Americans against the Russians and the Chinese, we have to try to avoid that because it would be disastrous for the economy, but also for our ability to deal with global challenges, such as the climate crisis. Of course, it also depends on the Chinese, right? The more assertive or aggressively that China behaves, the more Europe will likely move towards a more confrontational stance. But I think for the moment, the EU is still pursuing a very nuanced strategy, which says always that China is at the same time a partner, a competitor, and a rival. And I found it very noteworthy that at the EU-US summit in Brussels last week, the communique coupled precisely that language. So I felt that the US moved closer to the European view on this than the other way around. Now we must try to bring it into practice. So this is not that I want to emphasize about the EU somehow taking a midway position between the US and China. We are obviously much closer to the US. I think the preference is to pursue our interests together with the US whenever we can, but the interests do not entirely coincide. And so when on a specific topic, the interests diverge, then we must be able to pursue our own interests. And I think to respond finally to the viewer's question, it doesn't mean necessarily that interest in Europe declines, but the way we are looked at is different. We are seen, I think, much more in an instrumental way than before. The point of the Cold War was who controls Europe, Western Europe, right? In the end, the nodal point of the Cold War was Berlin. And you always knew that if push came to shove, if the Americans had to choose between Berlin and Saigon, they would prioritize Berlin, right? And indeed, Saigon is now Ho Chi Minh City. Berlin is not Khrushchevstadt or something like that. But now the priorities are different. So we're still massively important, but we're no longer the priority theater, and we have to take that into account. You can wish it away, but it will not go away. The global environment has changed, and I think it would be unwise to try and cling to the alliance as it was. I think it would make a lot more sense to recalibrate the alliance, make it more of an equitable alliance to adapt to the new global environment, and that way it will remain relevant and effective. Thank you.
Let me just quickly go to Julia Friedlander. Did you have the same interpretation of that communique that we just heard from Professor Biskup? Would you also say that the US moved closer to the European position rather than the reverse?
Not necessarily. I think that knowing how, having been part of these communique negotiations, of course, you have to reach common language and find something sort of agreeable terms for everybody within a short period of time. I think that reflects the fact that the text reflects the European strategic view. I mean, I think it shows that we're actually not that far apart in our assessment of the problem. And if it was a U.S. communique, it would read like our executive orders do, that do good deal of chest thumping. But ultimately, it has to be agreeable to everybody. So everybody gets a little bit of what they want out of those documents, but never what they really want. So I'm not sure it necessarily has moved the U.S. towards the European position, but maybe, I mean, it at least shows that we respect it. Yes.
Let me go now to Michael Link with a request that you also address the different regions that we had on our multiple choice there, and particularly talk a little bit about a region that we haven't spoken about much, which is the Eastern neighborhood, and what European strategic autonomy or sovereignty needs to mean in regard to Eastern Europe and also in regard to hybrid conflict capabilities that we have seen increasingly, of course, being put into play there.
It's increasingly and extremely important, I think, that we as European Union give those states or those countries of the Eastern Partnership, that we don't see them as a group. We should address them individually. All of them, of course, are very different. If you look to Belarus, then that is certainly a completely different case from Ukraine, from Moldova, from Azerbaijan, from Georgia, from Armenia. What we would propose as Free Democrats is that we say, yes, those states who take, for example, Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova, who are ready and willing to embark on a Euro-Atlantic future, sharing an aspiration, of course, of developing into rule of law, market economies, that they should have a long-term perspective by doing reforms, having also a perspective for membership in the EU. That is not for tomorrow, that is not for in 10 years, and that's not for in 20 years. Nobody can say when it will be. But if we don't have the courage to really say to them, there is a perspective for you, but it's up to you to do the necessary reforms for the future in order to come closer to, for example, EU structures, and maybe one day even be part of some of them, or even part of the EU as such in the very future, I think we would make a huge mistake. But let me say very clearly, because that is linked to what we discussed now with China. We have been, speaking as Free Democrats, we have been a little bit disappointed by the language of the communique, because I think it doesn't really reflect the aggressive attitude which we see from China. We don't want to see a Cold War with China, absolutely not. But we should not be blind and naive to see that China actually is interfering extremely in Europe, in many even EU member states. We had cases where Hungary was blocking very important foreign policy decisions because of Chinese influence in Hungary. So I think we have quite a dramatic situation, and I think it's a little bit dangerous that we, and here I really think that President Biden is clearer and more open and correct, that we should not underestimate the danger which is coming from China. We will very clearly address that in our electoral platform. that we see the human rights violations in China as extremely dangerous, and especially the interference of China in Europe, in EU states, and in future member states like, say, Serbia and others, as an extreme danger. And we should not paint that in a rose picture. There is basically a very aggressive stance from China, and therefore we should very clearly not sacrifice mentioning these dangers because of economic interests. I think it must be very clear that human rights and security come first. Economic interest, in this case of earning money in China, must come second. We have a shared interest with the US to develop a China-free 5G system. We have a shared interest with the United States in many areas of limiting China's influence in places abroad, where they clearly try to use the UN system in order to step by step in many decades, in a few decades, really to control more or less the United Nations. I think the situation is more dangerous than many people are facing, and therefore we are, from our side, not very satisfied with the communique. We think it's too rosy.
Bashar al-Halabi, may I ask whether you would like to say a few words about two aspects of this discussion? One is China's influence also within your own region. How is that shaping up, and what would your region want to see from Europe in terms of pushback? And secondly, Europe and human rights, whether in the Middle East, Europe is seen as a human rights values-driven actor, or whether people are disillusioned, perhaps not least because of Europe's failure to act in regard to Syria.
Well, to start with, China has slowly but surely expanded its influence in the Middle East and North Africa region, and in Africa also in general. And this has definitely played against the liberal parties or the liberal groups or even the youth, the liberalized youth that took to the streets in the past decade to protest the authoritarianism that they were facing, in addition to the dire socioeconomic situations. And China's growing interest and invested interest in the region, in addition to its growing partnerships and diplomatic relations with the authoritarians of the region, has only empowered them and played to their advantage in quelling the revolutions and also trying to block any democratic change or call for democratic change that was happening over the past decade. And it was at least the early 2010s were a sign of hope for everyone in the region, including Europe, that probably was sitting as a bystander at the time and looking at the region and seeing the rhetoric on the street kind of align with what it claims or what it stands for in general. But as time passed by, obviously, Syria was the turning point for that matter. And going back to what was mentioned right now or previously in the discussion, China played an active role in the UN and elsewhere in blocking any kind of accountability or justice to the millions of refugees that escaped Syria and that impacted and influenced the EU in general, in addition to the fact that it blocked accountability for probably one of the worst criminals of the modern day era. And as I mentioned, this was a turning point, and people started literally losing hope, and also became more and more disillusioned with the probably European rhetoric towards the region, because foundations and civil society groups that are supported by the EU on the ground continue to peddle the value and principle-based approach. However, we see things differently. And it is important for Europe to think that growing Chinese influence in the region means more and more kind of growing anti-Western, anti-liberal, anti-principled countries or at least ideas in the region, which will at some point come back to haunt the Europeans in general. Because imagine the entire neighborhood around the EU being or calling for more, I don't know, authoritarianism or acting on these things, this will only fire back, and this definitely does not play into Europe's interest. So Europe must step in. Definitely, this does not mean only on the military side, but also on the trade side, and also on growing economic ties with the region. Because right now, for example, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which are two of the powers trying to shape up this region, are China's biggest, or one of China's biggest trade partners in general. So there is a gap, there is vacuum that should not be left vacant, because this will backfire on everyone, literally, in the region.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Professor Biskup, I see that your hand was raised. I'm not sure if it was raised for a long time, but I've just now noticed it. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to react to what was said on China. In my view, we do have to distinguish between security, human rights, and economic interest. China's human rights violations in China are not dangerous for us. They are reprehensible, but they're not dangerous. A lot of Chinese foreign policy is dangerous if it directly threatens our interest. And I think our strategy should precisely be not to interlink them when it is not necessary, and to be aware of what is vital for us and what our leverage is. I always put it very bluntly for the sake of the argument. What is our vital interest in China? It is not how China treats the Chinese. It is how China treats us, and the same applies to Russia. We have a moral duty, I think, to condemn human rights violations in China and in Russia, but we have actually no power to change that. So China is a dictatorship, so is Russia. You can find reasons every day to adopt sanctions, but they're not going to change their policy for it. So let's not get stuck in an escalation of sanctions. Let's just continue to say it, what we find reprehensible, in every interaction at every level, and reserve the instrument of sanctions for when China or Russia crosses the line in their foreign policy. You know, the de facto military annexation of the South China Sea, cyber attacks in Europe, trying to coerce EU member states. You know, when they directly affect our interest, then we must proactively push back. I mean, this is not a comfortable position, maybe, but that's the reality. And just like during the Cold War for 45 years, we said to the Soviets that they should respect human rights, and wanted to do about it absolutely nothing. And I fear that vis-a-vis Russia today and vis-a-vis China today, we are in precisely the same situation. Again, we must be very pragmatic about it and not promise what we definitely cannot deliver. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
But that cannot be separated. It cannot be separated. I strongly disagree.
Let me go to Julia Friedlander, because, of course, this was a much, much debated topic under the Obama presidency, with Samantha Power arguing for a responsibility to protect and for other nations to essentially attempt to back that up. And Biden seems to see it a little bit differently, as far as I can divine. What's your take?
Well, I think starting out, Biden is entering office at a very unique point in U.S. history, where we realize that a lot of the values that we've been trying to promote abroad for so long, either through sort of neoliberal values that promoted most prominently under the George W. Bush administration, or on the Democratic side, trying to promote democracy and human rights through other means. We realize right now that a lot of the criticisms that we have levied on other countries actually apply to the United States. And so we're coming from a little bit of a point of humility after January 6th, for example, or understanding most how corruption is inherent in the way the United States has functioned, particularly under the last administration. So again, we're coming from a perspective of we have to do our homework at home with the same perspective and apply the same lens to the United States as we apply overseas. What I will say, because I came out of the Treasury Department on sanctions, is that there is a line that you have to draw between when sanctions are foreign policy and when they are financial policy. So when I think, Professor, when you say we're not going to affect actors' behavior, you have to think a little bit, maybe a little bit more carefully about that. Are you actually freezing their assets? Or are you, and you have a link to that specific nexus, either between the euro and the US dollar, to the assets that actor possesses and the ability of that actor to continue to perpetrate those activities on the ground of those assets? Or are you implementing a sanction symbolically? And that's what I worry that, the United States does it, the European Union does it all the time. And I worry that many of the measures that were implemented against Belarusian actors over the past week are symbolic, because we're showing our resolve, but we're not going to be able to hold feet to the fire, quite frankly, by taking money away from those people. So again, draw the line between when an action is symbolic in foreign policy and rhetorical, and when we are actually imposing real consequences.
Bashar al-Halabi, many rounds of sanctions have been imposed on Iranian leadership, of course, also on the Revolutionary Guard. We've seen sanctions imposed in multiple rounds vis-a-vis Russia. Do you become a little bit cynical about the effectiveness of sanctions?
We ought to become a bit cynical, but if we want to see things on the ground and how they've changed over the years, and specifically over the past 4 or 5 years, I don't think I can allude this to exactly an effect of sanctions, but it must be one of its consequences. Because, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon today, although it still enjoys massive support, financial and logistical support from the regime in Tehran, but it's also suffering, not to the same extent as other Lebanese political parties, but it is suffering from the financial and economic situation in general, and this is hitting at the heart of its base. And we saw since October 2019, we saw protests taking place in Hezbollah-dominated areas. We saw offices of MPs being attacked. We saw people starting to question the Hezbollah's ties with Iran in general. So, and this is something to reckon with, because this is not something simple or light to take lightly in general. And similarly, in Iraq, we've seen the revolution happen, or the uprising happen, also back in October 2019. We've seen the Iraqi youth attack and even burn down the Iranian consulate. We've seen at times the Iraqi militias disenfranchised and fighting against each other in turf wars or in trying to consolidate power. So all in all, what the lessons of the past decade can tell us, that Iran is definitely an actor that knows exactly what it wants in the region, but at the same time, this seesawing between policies has not benefited the region as a whole, nor has it benefited even the EU in general and its interests in the region. But only appeasing the regime in Tehran will not solve the problems, and the problems are many, and Iran is definitely one of the instigators in the region that is causing problems that are also reflecting on the national security of the EU. But at the same time, the approach has to be more nuanced and smarter in a way, rather than simply brute force, which only has hardened the regime in Tehran and has not really led to substantive change inside Iran in general, and not among its proxies and allies in the region.
Thank you very much. I want to bring in one last audience input, and it goes to Michal Link. And we have two comments, by the way, from the audience that reinforce what you have said on several occasions in our discussion, Mr. Link. One comment saying that European strategic autonomy does not and should not mean getting away and isolating from the US, and another comment saying that a Franco-German confederation would be the best way to drive autonomy forward. But beyond that, a specific question to you, and it's this: how can Europe be more autonomous or sovereign without having its own command structures?
Well, of course, it is normal to have command structures. That's clear. But I clearly warn that when you have an existing alliance, as NATO is, and it's the best military alliance we ever had, we should not waste this command structure we have by duplicating this. Practitioners from the military side, from the Bundeswehr as well as from other armies, and I'm very close, for example, to the German French brigade, and to these, I've studied a lot these joint military groups, what we have, units, what we have in the EU, both with the Netherlands and with Poland, Denmark. I think the practitioners, politically I have nothing against own command structures, but the practitioners say, let's not duplicate it, it leads nowhere, especially where more and more European non-EU NATO members are really playing such a big role. I recall Norway and the UK, and with their enormous military capacity, of course, especially of the UK and their budget, I think it really makes no sense to duplicate and replicate the command structures. But that is, I know, a controversial issue, but I clearly prefer to have consolidated command structures. But maybe there are also mixed systems. I would simply caution against risking the efficiency of NATO, because NATO apparently has an impact. NATO apparently is respected by the Russian Federation. NATO apparently is respected by China. So let's not risk a functional thing by creating additional structures. So far from this side, but apart from that, in terms of bringing together, also horizontally, for example, joining and merging procurement, like as we do with the German, French, Spanish fighter plane, and with the main ground combat system, which is the next thing, the battle tank of the future, to make joint procurement and to develop it together with our EU partners. I think that's the way to go. That is the key thing, because otherwise we will certainly never be able to really produce strategically important things here in the EU.
Thank you very much. And that was the last word for our discussion on strategic autonomy, because our time is up. But I would like to say very warm thanks to all of our speakers for participating in this very multifaceted and intensive exchange of views on where European strategic autonomy is going, and both its preconditions and its limits. Thank you very, very much for being with us, Julia Friedlander, Sven Biskup, Michael Link, and Bashar al-Halabi. And thanks as well to all of those who helped make this discussion possible behind the scenes. Thank you to the Naumann Foundation for Freedom for being our host. And especially thank you, dear audience, for your attention and for your participation throughout our discussion. Have a good evening, and come and join us once again tomorrow for the third in our series, when we will be taking a look at educational cooperation and its post-pandemic future. Hope to see you then. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.